Hey everybody, it's George the Antique Nomad, and I am doing an appraisal fair. You can tell by the sign behind me, I'm in Greensboro, Florida. There's a lot of interesting history in this area, and we're going to see some of it inside there and also do appraisals. So come on, let's go. What a nice thing you're doing. I mean, the preservation of the house is great, and it's just really exciting. I like doing appraisal fairs in small places. I have seen more interesting things in little towns that I've seen in big cities. I think in rural places, people are more practical and they keep things because they're useful, and they keep things because they've got family connection. Maruhan ware, this pattern is called Della Robbia, and this says made in Japan. And so when it says made in Japan, we know that makes it 1920s or 30s. Around the turn of the last century, we got kind of fed up with them sending over stuff and dumping it on our market and putting our companies out of business. So they said, well, we're going to do something about that. We're going to make them put the country of origin on everything. They called their country Nippon, so they put Nippon on it. And we let them do that for about 10 years. And then we said, no, you have to put Japan because that's what we call you. So they changed it to made in Japan. So that tells us that this is 1920s or 30s. It does seem like it has one crack. It's tight, but I would say don't put a lot of hot water in it real fast, or keep it in a hot place. You know, make sure that it doesn't get big temperature extremes so that that doesn't grow. In the condition it's in, it's probably worth about $30 to $35.
When I bought it in Dania Beach, Florida, which you probably know
oh,
is
yes,
an antique.
That is an antique place.
That had been repaired.
Okay, so she's got one little repair on her hand. Looking at this mark and the way this one is done and the way the lights are set up in here, I would say that this one was probably done sometime in the early part of the 20th century. So it might be before the Second World War, probably 1930s is what I imagine from the way it's done. It's got a lot of applied flowers, and that was a lot of the style. Capodimonte competed with Dresden and Meissen and those areas where they made this sort of porcelain. And Capodimonte for a while actually outpaced them and was the darling of this stuff, and really was the most popular. By the 20th century, they're still doing a lot of the hand painting and the hand applied florals. And the good thing on yours is that even though she's got the little bit of damage there, the flowers are all intact. And so it would be a lot easier to have a porcelain restorer fix that hand than it would be to fix all of this stuff. And the fact that it's got the original shade not broken is also important. So because of all of those things, I think that the price you paid for it was maybe a little bit on the cheap side. I think you got a pretty good deal. I could imagine that this would probably $150 to $165 currently. And then if you were able to find a good porcelain restorer to fix the hand, she might sell for $225.
She said it was a sachet that they would hang in the wardrobe because everybody's clothes back then were stinky because they never washed them.
Right, because it was hard. Exactly. You didn't just throw your stuff in the laundry. You hung it up and hoped it smelled a little better and aired out, and then you wore it again because it was just impractical otherwise. This is a really neat thing, and you really rarely see these. I've actually never had one and held in my hands before. So you have something I've never actually gotten to touch in person, which is neat. And that is exactly right. Everything she said. They also would have used pomanders. Pomanders are little things that look like Easter eggs, usually made of porcelain with a bunch of holes in them, and they'd put powder in them and put those in the drawers to try to keep the stuff fresh. But this would have hung up in the closet. It would have been to put, potpourri or whatever salts or whatever you needed in here, so that it would, again, also maybe at a certain point, mothballs. The kind of things that people needed to try to keep the critters out of their stuff. It's neat because it's got this gold lame thread. It's a very early 1900s piece, I would say. These rhinestones with the clips, these are definitely something we see between about 1900 and maybe 1920 at the latest. And she just gave it to you. I think she gave you a pretty nice gift. You must have cleaned really well, because this... I would think that this probably in the right hands nowadays, I would think $65 to $85, because you just don't really see them at all.
This is a chalk drawing.
Very nice. Yes, I'll hold it up so everybody can see, and also so I can look at the glass. So this is a chalk pastel. And how did you get this, and do you know anything about it?
There was an old barn-like structure on Highway 98. If you've been there, you would know it. And it was in the very back. It wasn't like they so swell junk.
Right.
Yeah. And in the very, very, very back of the barn, it was under and behind a bunch of stuff.
These sorts of images were very popular in the 19-teens and 20s, and that's when this is going to date, sometime probably about 1915. They were done commercially by artists in a given area to sell. They might come and paint a local scene over and over and sell it until everybody who wanted one had one, and then they'd move on to another town. And there's a few of those artists who've ended up becoming famous. So if I had, there's one named Havilar, I've got a small painting from it. It's just palm trees, but it ended up, they became famous here in Florida as an artist. If we had an artist signature, we might be able to connect it to somebody, but I don't see one. You'll notice it's in its original frame, which is great. It also has its original cardboard, which is actually not great. If you are going to keep this piece, I would spend the money. It doesn't cost much. It might be $5 or $10 to get a piece of acid-free mat and replace the cardboard. They used cardboard because it was a cheap thing, and it was something they were just painting and selling and making some money on, and they weren't thinking about 100 years from now the acid in the cardboard is going to start messing up my picture, but it will. We really have to value it as a decorative piece because we don't know who the artist is, and that price to me would be probably somewhere around 100.
Well, awesome.
And let's see what your other one is.
For the two of them.
Oh, good. Well, let's see the other one. Oh, this is nice. Now, this one I think is a little better, actually, and it's a little older as well. First of all, you see it's got wood on the back instead of cardboard because they used to do little thin sheets of wood as the backing rather than the cardboard backing. And then on the front here, we have this very nice, also a pastel. Also, I don't see an artist attribution, but we've got this very nice scene of the trees here. And this one's got a little bit more detail than the other one. It's also in a little bit fancier frame. This frame would date to about the 1910 period. Now, you notice it's missing a couple of the corners here. If you wanted to restore that, the way they do that, believe it or not, is they take silly putty, they make a casting of the one good one, and then you pour plaster in there and let it dry, and you cut it out, and you put it in your corners, glue it back on, and then paint to match, and that's how they restore old frames. Not going to devalue it too much because of those losses, because I think that's something that can be fixed pretty easily. I would say this one probably $125, $135 would be a retail price on it now.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's a darning egg.
Yes, that is correct. And how did you get the darning egg?
I inherited this from my great aunt.
I like stories of things that have been in families because, you know, this is a utilitarian thing and every household would have had one back when these were made. This is going to be, I imagine, around 1910 or so. And she used it a whole lot. It is really, really worn, which I think is great. A lot of people really enjoy this sort of stuff and fall in the line of primitives because it's something, this may have been made by a machine or it may have been made by hand, but it was something that was made very basically to be a utilitarian thing that you just used and you used it until you were done with it and then you threw it away and you got or made another one. She did a lot of socks on this. I mean, this is actually one of the more worn I've ever seen. It's got a hole in the bottom, the whole top of the crown where you can tell that she hit it with the needle a whole bunch of times. But you know, you didn't just throw away a pair of socks because I imagine there were a couple of little, probably a general store or two in this town. Then the next place you would have gone would be Quincy. Then you had to go all the way to Tallahassee. Then you had to go all the way to Jacksonville or Pensacola if you wanted, you know, fancy goods or certain types of things. So you did for yourself. We are so spoiled in this day and age of, well, you can just go to Walmart and buy 6 pairs of socks in a bag for $12. And, you know, people spent hours and hours and hours saving a sock back then. So anyway, I like the story it tells. It's not that it's super valuable. It's just that it's a real part of the way people lived. And I'd say probably $15 to $20 on that. And then you said you weren't sure what this one was.
Right.
Okay.
That belonged to the same great aunt. And she kept that in her corn crib.
I wonder if she was using it to scoop, even though it's a center handle then, because It's made like a firkin. A firkin is a barrel where they use these wood slats on the side, and the wood slats come and taper to a point. And usually they are a barrel shape, but I've never seen one with a handle in the middle. And that makes me think that she was using it for some specific purpose, either to draw stuff out, like maybe she was putting it in a corn crib to scoop.
She used it to measure shelled corn.
That makes some more sense then. What I think it is, if you notice, the wood on the inside is a little different than the wood on the outside. This seems to be a different grain of wood, and certainly it's not been polished the same way, so it has a different color as well. And I think what it was that she had a firkin or an old barrel, and she needed something for that purpose, so she probably, I'm guessing, because this is usually how it went back then, is she told the man of the house, hey, I need that to do such and such. And he said, okay. And he found something and drilled a hole and put a handle in. And then we have this other device. I would say, again, probably 19 teens or 20s at the latest for this. But I'm leaning more towards teens because I'm seeing the way they attached it together. And I think the value on this, probably $40 to $50 is if you saw it in a shop that really was devoted to primitives and that sort of thing. I would think you might see that kind of a tag on it. It's absolutely English, and it's got a great crest on it. And you said your great grandparents, yeah. And they thought about 1860. Right. It's a very heavy silver plated tray, and my guess is that it's over probably a copper base because it's got so much weight. They would put the silver plate on top of other things. E & Company. But it's very good quality, and it's the CM and Company. Yeah, this is English silver plate. That's a Trojan design from way back that is brought into decoration of things in the 1860s or so. It's a nice piece. It's substantial. The condition's really good. Silver plate in general is not super collectible anymore because people don't like to polish, but the people who like silver plate want pieces like this. They want something that's substantial. They like things that are 19th century rather than 20th. They want something that has really good design and is in great condition like this. The fact that it's a footed tray and a serving piece is a better thing. My estimate of value on this is probably somewhere in the $150 to $175 range, I would think, retail these days.
Okay, very good. This I've probably ruined it because I polished it.
Ah, okay. Well, we'll talk about polishing a little. How did you get this?
At a garage sale.
Okay, and did you know what it was when you got it? Okay.
Yeah.
Did they know what it was when you got it?
I paid $50.
You paid $50, so they had an idea it was something. And it is, because on the back where you polished out, we can see the label, and the label on it says Tiffany Studios, New York. So this is Tiffany. They did a line called De Oro, which was not gold, but it was to look like gold around 1910. And I would say that this is something made about that time as well. And the idea was Tiffany was really interested in metalwork. Even his glass he'd sprayed with the gold to make it look like metal. That was a really big thing. And metalworking was very popular around 1890, 1900 when a lot of these designs were being done. And they wanted to do something that was a better quality and had their name with it. So this is heavy. It's well made. Have you ever looked into this?
I saw it in a book on Tiffany. Now, that would be the Tiffany jeweler, not the one that made the stained glass.
Right. There's a couple of Tiffany's involved. Yes, exactly. The jeweler and then the stained glass one, but they eventually all end up being one thing. Well, let's talk about polish. Okay.
Yeah.
Polish probably wasn't the greatest thing to do to it. However, I imagine you did it because it was probably dark and pitted and very uneven. How did you polish it? What did you use?
I use Brasso.
You use Brasso. Okay. Usually I don't recommend Brasso because it leaves things really, 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 really bright. It's a little too good. So that wouldn't have been my favorite way to do it. I would like to see it have some more patina like this. You know how you get that? Just don't polish it again.
Yeah.
It'll be fine. It'll eventually mellow out where this is not so shiny brassy. It will, and I understand, you know, also there is something where something has been let go so long that you really can't see the detail or it's spotted. And so, you know, there is a point where actually doing some sort of a polish is something that would be good. I would probably recommend, if you ever polish it again, maybe get like a jeweler's cloth and polish it with that, because it's a little less harsh. But this will eventually tarnish back again, and it will make you really irritated, but it will actually be good for the piece. And the value on it, I would say probably $225 to $250. And I think when it ages out a little bit more, it'll probably be worth a little bit more.
Okay.
But for $50, I think you did just fine.
Thank you.
What is it?
Well, it's just a dish. It's just meant to be, yeah, it's not meant for any particular thing. It would have probably, honestly, because it's fairly plain, Tiffany in the arts and crafts era, it wasn't all about fancy design. Some of these were also made to be something that, and I'm going to go with the stereotype because it was 1910 or whatever, a man would have had this to put his coins, his keys, his important stuff by the front door on a table. That's pretty much who your customer was for that.
This is a record of a silver mine in Peru.
Oh, this is very
That's
interesting.
just a little picture of the mine.
General plan of the Cayoma mine in Arequipa, Peru. Well, that's pretty interesting. And I like the,
Can you see that?
yeah, this looks really cool. First of all, you've got this great parchment to hold it in. And then when we open it up, oh my goodness, yeah. Wow. Okay, this is pretty interesting. The very first entry we see says 1649. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got this or anything you were told about it?
It was my great-grandfather was a secretary of the mine, and they gave it to him.
Very interesting.
We don't
Ha.
know.
He was the secretary of the mine, and one way or another he got it. Okay. I don't read enough Spanish to be able to tell you in great detail, but they're talking about the various plats, and they have them all numbered so that you can go, and then there's a description of the plat with each thing. This is something, you know, basically to tell them where to go to look for what kind of things and which mine has them.
And I think we were told it's a record of what was taken.
A record of what was taken from the mine, and it does seem correct, because it seems that someone has to sign at each point for the amount of whatever ore they are taking out of this mine.
Silver.
It was silver. Well, this is really interesting, and it is not exactly like anything I've seen before. Valuing something like this is going to be a little difficult because it is one of a kind. It's specific to a particular place. The fact that it's still in business means that there might be interest by the people involved with it. It's even possible the company running the mine would find this interesting as part of their archives. Now, having said that, does that mean that they're going to pay a lot of money for it? Well, a lot of museums are basically just funding their operations and keeping things going, and then hoping for donors or people to come along to help with the more expensive things, because museums are expensive to run. So they typically are not spending a lot of money on acquiring things. The last time I saw anything I would consider even comparable to this was a bunch of documents pertaining to a lumber company, actually, also in Latin America, also colonial era. And that was in Mexico rather than Peru, but they did seem to have a sort of similar book. Sometimes when we go to do comparables, we don't have something that's exactly the same, so we have to do our best based on other things that we've seen. And when we evaluated that, we ended up coming up with a value somewhere in the range of $1,000 to $1,200. Now, if you had something that gave you some sort of rights to the mine, well, then that would be a different story entirely. And that does happen once in a while.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much. That was interesting. Aw, this is very cute. It's going to be a little tiny for you folks out there in the audience to see, because it's a really little bar pen. The Edwardian is early 1900s, where this very fine filigree jewelry is in style. And it's got a little blue stone, which may be a sapphire. We're going to take a look. I'm not a gemologist, but I've seen a lot of these, and I usually can tell. It does not have any mark for sterling on it. It is not platinum either, because I just looked at the little this little catch right here. See right there, it's very tiny. That says 14K. So this is actually 14 karat gold. And not all 14 karat gold was marked in this country before about 1915. And about 1915 is when I think this was made. The reason it looks silver is it's what they would have used white gold and then done some sort of a wash on the back. And so it looks more gold on the back, but they wanted the silver to show on the front. It's a very pretty piece. And even though it's small, because it's 14 karat, I think your value is probably somewhere in the $125 to $150 range for that piece, even though it's little.
The family was from Pennsylvania. This, I have no idea.
Okay, well, let's start with this. And you said that this was from, I'm sorry, which part of the family?
Grandmother's mother. And I don't know where she got it, but that's just how it came to her.
But you said they were from Pennsylvania. And that is an area we see a lot more of these, and so it makes sense. First of all, this would have been rather heavy for Florida, so you wouldn't have expected to find a lot of these down here. And also, they're a little early for Florida because these are coverlets. There was a loom made in France around the 1840s called a jacquard loom, where they could do long strips of fabric continuously, and that was a big difference for them. And because of that, they could make all these strips and then sew them together into these coverlets. And so you'll see somewhere in here, like down the middle of this one, where you have binding between two different strips of fabric. So when you pick it up, it looks like it's a continuous design. But that's because the seaming is all where the design made. And they were very popular, and they kept making them through probably the 1860s or 70s. They're made of wool. A lot of these are natural dyes. They used indigo. They used various natural vegetable dyes to get these reds. And so that makes them more interesting as well. I would say the value on this now is probably in the $250 to $300 range, because they are very popular right now. And it's nice too, because you notice we've been looking at the blue side, but there's actually, the red side is actually more finished looking. And then this rug, you said, came from the same family?
The other side, my husband's father's family. So his grandma and his father.
They would have used these as saddle blankets. They would have used them on beds. They would have hung them as art also on a wall for color, but which is what's being done now. And you can see that was done quite a while ago. This would have been a hoop where it could have been held on with a strap. We can tell by the way it's pieced together. If you look at it closely, you notice all of this is piecework. There's little holes around it. I think it's really neat. I would say that this dates to probably 1920 or earlier, possibly even the late 1800s. And that is good. The market for these became a little bit depressed. I can help you fold. Became a little bit depressed when the Afghan war happened. Every time there's a war, GIs buy the thing that's interesting in that area and send it home. So all of a sudden we had a glut of this stuff. So unfortunately, the people who were the most affected by the wars in the Middle East on the ground, a lot of them were the people who lived in the areas where the weavers were. So they were forced into refugee camps. And so they bailed and dumped all their stock on the market. Because of that, the prices are depressed right now. That will not stay that way forever, especially because now that they've been in refugee camps and they've met each other, the styles are all changing. They're all intermixing, and they're not going to be pure like they were before. And so the period stuff from before that happened, where it's more easy to see. Somebody who had a lot more expertise than I have probably could look at that and tell you exactly what tribe made it just by the pattern. And that won't be the case anymore because it's all getting mixed up. So I think in the long run, that's a very good piece to hold on to, and that it will grow in value. In the meantime, probably $650, depending where you sold it.
Keep it packed up.
I would keep it, yes. If you are keeping it and you're not using it a lot, every 6 months or so, fold it a different direction. Because if you fold something and leave it for years and years, sometimes those fold lines will become permanent.
Is it vintage or made to look vintage?
Okay, vintage or made to look. Well, that's always the question on these, and I see what you paid for it. Yeah. And was this another thrift store find? One thing to look at on the bottom of these, because you were asking about age, and if you notice the bottom, it's got this 4-part sort of segmented bottom. We usually don't see that until 1970s or 80s. Usually they had just a flat bottom. The reason they went to this is this part's dry, and when they fire it on a kiln, they want to make sure that it peels off without breaking, that the glaze hasn't stuck. And so they leave the foot dry. And it used to be that they didn't do that on all four at a cross like this, but they found over time with quality control, it was better if they had more sitting on the kiln that was dry. And so that's when you see these. Even though it's large and it's heavy-ish, if it was older, it would probably weigh 50% more because it would be denser than this. So I think you're looking at something that is, you know, you paid $15. I think you're looking at a $35 item, and it has a little bit of age, but not a ton.
Compliment signature at the top. And I've tried to look her up and found her, but I can't find anything on her.
That is really good that you spotted that, because a lot of people would have just thrown this away. And yes, that is interesting. Right.
It's got her name right there, so how could they miss it?
Exactly. Right here it says compliments of Mary Spencer Conrad, December 5th, 1898. So after this was printed, she gave this to somebody and signed it up in the corner. And that makes it really something a little more special and a little different. It's black Americana. The condition is not good. But because of the signature, and I have to say, I don't have other information on this musician. The way it was done back then is one person would write the song and one person would write the lyrics, and then oftentimes the person who was singing the song would choose the lyrics and the song, and they would put them together. It was done actually in pieces as a formula.
1896.
It took things a while to dissipate. I mean, we didn't have radios. Oh, I heard this at a beer hall down the street, and I thought that was really great. We ought to play that. Where do I get that music? And things would dissipate slowly. So the fact that this was given by her 2 years after this was published, nowadays, we would think, oh, that's a whole lot of time. Songs would stay out on the market for 3 or 4 or 5 years and often be covered by various different people. So I'll bet somewhere on a cylinder disc this song exists. It's written in the dialect, yeah.
Some of the other black composers came along. They despised it.
Right, because they didn't want it written in the dialect. They wanted them to... We don't talk like that anymore. Exactly. Yeah, that's actually a very good point. If it was in good shape, I would say that that would probably be a $40 or $50 item because of the artist, because the musician signed it. Otherwise, it'd be about a $15 item. This is a very little town in the Panhandle west of Tallahassee, and we are in front of a very important historic structure here. This is the Dezell house. This was built in 1912. It is a prairie style, and it is old style. You notice it is all up on blocks because they did not have air conditioning in Florida back then, and so you built your house on blocks so the air could circulate underneath. Well, you could not have a house in Florida without a screen porch back in 1912, and you would have furnished it with the latest in wicker furniture. This looks like one of those pieces by Lloyd's Looms. Nice oak arts and crafts piece from about the time this house would have been built as well. Then we come into the main parlor. It's very fancy for something built in this area. Florida was still basically just coming out of its pioneer stage in 1912.
He had his own sawmill. That's what he did for a living, was make furniture.
Oh, I see. So that's why the nice woodwork in here.
And so all the woodwork to the house is original.
It's a very nice tile, which looks like it might have been created by Rookwood in Ohio.
Mr. Dezell came here from Illinois. He met a local girl and got married. And
she didn't want to leave.
No.
Look at these great arts and crafts sconces from about 1912 when this place was new. Those are just beautiful. They look like they are in the style of Tiffany or Dezell. The Roseville pine cone is very stately on this shelf. This would have come out in the 1920s and been luxury goods for this area.
The skylight in the center, which catches the light from the dormers.
That is really neat that there is a skylight. Nobody did that back then. Look at this tiny child's rocker with the velvet. This is 1890s. What a really cute piece. And then a great fire nozzle with the handles. The cottage style of the fire alarms, these are worth a few $100s each and are pretty popular now. These are all things from the Quincy, Florida Fire Department.
Greensboro did not exist
until 1907 when they built the railroad.
Okay, yeah, I thought this was a later town.
This is one of the few surviving houses. Most of the houses in Greensboro have either been torn down or burned.
Right. Such a common story everywhere. A fire was just such a terrible thing. I mean, there just were not the ways to prevent the damage that it caused. Once something caught fire, it was gone. So, gosh, it's so nice that this is still here. And that was a prominent family. And you can tell it's a very nice house. This looks like it was...
It did not look like this when we got it.
Oh, I bet. You probably had to do a little bit of restoration, I'm imagining.
Every wall had paneling. We took all that down and redid some of the plasterwork, and then we also, of course, put up some sheetrock because it was easier. But the woodwork is the original woodwork. And then everything in the house is either donated or on loan to us, or we bought in a thrift store.
Oh, that's fantastic. So you thrifted a lot of the stuff that's in the displays. That's amazing.
Everything that's just the Chotsky stuff that's just sitting around.
Yeah, you just found stuff that was appropriate to the era and brought it in.
It's all from thrift stores.
Rural history is really, really important to preserve because it says so much more about the way people really lived. I mean, people are all caught up in cities and what's going on there, but that's not how most people lived in 1912. No. And this is much more indicative of how things really were. So I just love that you've been able to create it this way.
And a lot of this, as you see, is from the 1950s and 60s. But this house, the people who lived in this house, she did not die until the early 50s. And
right.
So it was sold. And so it's a hodgepodge of years. I mean,
I think it's great. You're not trying to be, this is exactly the way it was in 1912. They get some stuff when they first move into a house. They have kids and they start getting things that relate to the kids. They go through generations. People get married. They move on. People move back home. I mean, it's going to be a layer of things. And this is how, and I really like the fact that it shows different things from different eras during the time that the people lived here.
We needed a dedicated kitchen. So we found these old cabinets.
Oh, this is great.
In an old house. In fact, one of our members, it's her grandmother.
In 1912, some people wouldn't have even had the kitchen attached to the house still because they would have been afraid of house fires. Right. And then as time went on, this is what happened. You added a back room, you put on a lean-to, you did something, and you put in what was the new modern kitchen, which was all wood with porcelain counters or all steel if you were a little bit later in time than this. Right. But this looks exactly right. This looks like something 1920s. And that's when kitchens became modern. So this is how houses are. I love it. It's very real.
Our business room of businesses of Gadsden County, and you have everything in here from pharmacies to banks, the first electrical company. This area did not have electricity until 1940, early 1940s.
Wow, no electricity in town until the 40s. Yep. Well, this is the Deep South. This the way it was.
Mr. Dezell had a generator, and this house had electric. It had knob and tube, and the knob and tube wiring was still in the house when we got it.
Oh, yes.
And he had a light bulb, a single light bulb, and a single receptacle in every room.
Yes.
Run by the generator.
And that would have been more than enough for a generator by itself to handle. Interesting. So they had one of the few electrified houses in town then.
Yes, they did.
Now, do you ever see any of his furniture in the community, or do you folks have any pieces? I imagine it's hard to identify.
We know of a desk that he made that we've been trying to get that was his desk, but we haven't been successful in getting it yet.
I'm glad you've identified one. It'd be great for the museum to have one piece just to show.
It would be fabulous. Our biggest project we have going on right now is identifying the old rural public schools. So we're in the process now of locating those installing historical markers at those locations, and building a website.
So they were spaced 6 miles apart. I wondered,
Yes.
I wondered what was considered
Well,
okay
we had
for kids.
102 of them.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so what we're really looking for is the early Rosenwald schools. And Rosenwald was Julius Rosenwald. He was the co-owner of Sears and Roebuck. He teamed up with Booker T. Washington from the Tuskegee Institute, and he sold plans from Sears and Roebuck, and they all really look the same. The early Rosenwald schools will be a pattern from a Sears and Roebuck company. And when they teamed up, they had to get a commitment from the county that they would maintain these schools. And what we have found is a lot of times when they were done with that school, when desegregation was over.
Hill was a Rosenwald school. Midway was a Rosenwald school. Shiloh was a Rosenwald school.
Interesting. And I see the similarity of the window patterns and all of that.
They all had large windows because there was no electricity.
Right. You had to have lots of light.
They told you what orientation to put the school so that the light would come in.
Every little area had to have its own because, you know, how far could kids go? They didn't have buses. They had to walk.
And this was the segregated South.
Right. So you had to have
It did not integrate fully until 1971.
Right. So you had black schools and white schools and yes.
And so there were 8 Rosenwald schools built in Gadsden County.
They did not tear these schools down. These schools are like people's houses. They were moved to other schools and combined. It's a real fascinating history. Many of these schools are from 1869.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wow. That's very early even for here.
Wow, yeah. This right here is the Greenshade School. That is a Rosenwald school. It was moved. We had actually met with the church members. The church is still there. We met with them last week, and we recorded their memories of attending the Greenshade School.
Oh, okay.
They never experienced integration. Some of them grew up on the Lastly farm, growing tobacco. We asked them about prejudice and, all those things. He said, oh, we grew up on the farm. We just all played together. Nobody had color, and the other guy said, and then I went to the military. No, we weren't any color. We were just all fighting to save each other's lives, So there was
I know an antique dealer in her 70s who's a black gal from Mississippi, and she said the same thing. She said out on the farm, we didn't really have the luxury of discrimination because the next person was the closest person you could get to, and you might have to help each other, and there just wasn't time for that.
No, you just
And so she was really shocked because then she became a teacher, and right in the early 60s moved to town, and she said that was the first time she had ever really experienced discrimination. Oh gosh, there's so much cool stuff here. Well, let's go do some appraisals and then we'll come back and do some more looking around the house. This is great.
Really old, or if it's, when they started.
They're reproducing, yes.
It was in an old farmhouse in Pennsylvania, sitting on the corner of the stairs, and I walked in the house. I was a visitor and saw it and went, "Oh, honey, don't leave it on the steps." And when she came to visit me, she brought it to me and she said, "I think you should have it."
Aw, that's a great story. Well, I love it when people give people things just because you obviously spotted it and you thought enough to think, hey, you should preserve this. And she was right. It should have gone with you. Because if they were just leaving it on the steps, it's got a few cracks already. It just needed one more good fall to be done. This is Spatterware, and this is a stoneware, if you look at the bottom. So it's a heavy earthenware. These were generally made in the Midwest. Somewhere in Pennsylvania as well, but a lot of companies in the Midwest made this sort of thing around the late 1800s. This one doesn't have any real clue as to who the maker is. We know it's American, but that's about all we'll be able to say as far as that goes. The style is very much what you saw with the little band down here, 1880, 1890. The spattering was basically done because it was a cheap and easy way to make things look a little bit more ornamental rather than it just being a plain-sided brown or gray. They just sort of go around and sponge it on. And so it's what we call spongeware, but this one is a little more deliberate. They didn't just do it all over. They kind of did it in circles. They're trying to make a bit of a pattern to it. Blue is popular. I mean, it's just, it's got a lot going for it as these go. If this was in perfect shape, it's probably $85 to $100. I think it's a great piece. I can't tell you a whole lot more as far as the maker, but it definitely is old, and I'd say probably 120 to 130 years old at least.
This is by Manuel Gonzalez.
Runyon. Mm-hmm.
He lived in the Pensacola area and was active, I think, probably from early he was born in late 1800s, 1870 or so, and died by 1950. There's some of his stuff is displayed in New Orleans, and then there's, I think, a whole museum for him in Pensacola.
Yeah, I was going to say, he is a known regional artist here in this area, which is great, and it's so much fun to see something like this. I have a little awareness of Runyon just because I ran into him. You know, it's funny, downstate we just sort of figure, oh yeah, well, there's the Panhandle and then there's everything else and it's different. But the truth is that people do move between the two areas, and I happen to have an estate sale where they had 3 or 4 of the pieces by Runyon, and I had to do a little studying, and everything you said is right and actually very helpful. Well, you know what? That's where we all start, and that is a good place to get started on this stuff. And yes, there is a museum in Pensacola that features the work. There is an aftermarket, and that's an important thing, because when we're talking about art pricing, the question is there a secondary market? Yes, it's old, it's pretty, it's nice, but do people look for that particular artist? And in this case, they definitely do. The one I just held up was 1947. This one is 1918. So he worked for quite a while, which is also good, because a lot of, you want them to have worked long enough to be prolific enough for there to be a group of collectors. When there's regional interest in something, it makes a big difference. The place that this is the most valuable is around here, because this is where this artist came from and is the best known, and where there's the most people interested because of the museum and everything. And I have a sense of what I think the value is, but did you look anything up when you found out he was listed? I think you're looking at $500 to $700 a piece for the pieces, because Runyon is definitely someone who's sought after now. There are not that many artists from this region who are famous, and that's part of it. The fact that he painted Florida scenes helps, and the fact that he painted long enough that you will actually find pieces like this around here. If you look at museums in an area, you will get an idea for what the people there think is more interesting, and what they're collecting, and kind of what the style and flavor of an area is too. And I think that that's really helpful if you're traveling, because, there's sleepers out there. I bet that in some house somewhere, there's a Runyon hanging that'll be $20 at an estate sale at some point in the next year or two, because they just don't know better. Which part of the family did this come from?
My husband's side.
Husband's side, okay. Well, it is a very pretty clock, and I noticed that it's got a very ornate pendulum, and it does seem to work. It seems like it's keeping time.
Okay.
And that is very important, and it's nice because we've just set it down on a table that's not completely level, and usually you have to level them to make them work, so yours wants to run.
Okay.
Now, because of that, what I'm going to do to send it home to you so that it doesn't spring the mechanism, I'm actually going to take your pendulum. I'm going to lift it just a little, and I'm going to take it off.
Okay.
There's just a little hook right there it goes in. It's best not to move the clock with the pendulum in it, because sometimes it can spring the works. And since this is working well, but it gives us a chance to show what the pendulum looks like, which is actually a very beautiful piece, and it's weighted. That's why you've got that piece in the center there, so that it is the right weight to make the movement move the correct amount. And this piece is American. Sometimes they tell us right on them who made them. A lot of times they would have had a big piece of paper on the back, which this one at one time had, that would have told the model and the information about the clock, but it's missing. But it's definitely American. I would say it's probably Seth Thomas or Ansonia. They were made in Connecticut. All the clocks in America were pretty much Connecticut made at that time, because there's nothing on the movement that shows us the name of the maker. When you see this detail in here, this is what they call spoon carving, and they associate this with the American Eastlake style. A spoon is basically a certain shape of woodworking implement that would give you these little rounds and everything. And then this one's nice because it's got the picture in the glass and it's reverse painted on the back, screen painted. And you notice it's got winged griffins on either side. This is an late 1870s decorating style where you see this kind of detail with the figural griffins. You'll see Old North Wind, various figures like that. This is what they call the aesthetic period of design in the 1870s and 80s. The fact that it works is great. This would have been considered a kitchen clock when they're narrow and tall like this. Okay. You've got the time and strike. You don't have what some kitchen clocks had. See this little band in the middle? Okay. This was set up so they could have put another dial in there where that would have been an alarm clock. So you would actually use that and wind it separately. If you were cooking, you would use that as your minute timer. Oh, okay. And so you'll see those on these sometimes. This one's really nice. Now, the clock market is not as good as it used to be because everybody has a digital phone now, and that's a lot of people's clocks. Because of that, the prices have come down. We are just starting to see, it's been long enough now, and enough younger people are saying, oh yeah, well, oh, a clock, that's what that is. Oh, that's interesting. I think I'll have one of those because that's an interesting thing to have in the house. And so now it's starting to be obsolete enough where there's people starting to collect them again. So right now the value is honestly probably only about $125. 20 years ago, I would have told you $100 more than that. And maybe 8 or 10 years from now, I expect to be able to tell you closer to that amount because I do think we're starting to see a rebound on these. We've got one more item that's come in here, and we're going to just sit in this nice old rocker and look at it.
Great-great-great-grandmother gave it to my grandmother, and it was supposed to be from her grandmother who came from Scotland.
Okay, I see. So it's been in the family for several generations.
I can remember at the center part, it had bits of paper that have worn off during the years, but it looked like a Roman, not Celtic necessarily, because it was hard sides, hard corners.
Right, interesting. And that may have to do with they put something in there to seal it so the stuff wouldn't fall out. But I just love that. The reason I wanted to show it is because when you open it up, you said that there is, you said your great?
My grandmother did the tatting. Mm-hmm. My great-grandmother's hair when she was young, and then right when she passed.
Aw, that is so sweet. Now the freshwater oyster.
And it comes one more part. The top of it comes off too.
So there's the hair, there's the tatting, there's the hair as a younger person. Oh, this is so neat that this has been used for all these memories. And yes, the top comes off as well. And so let's put this back together and talk about what it was originally, and then we'll get into, and I've got to find that freshwater pearl, which is fallen right there. What a neat little keepsake box this is. And originally, my feeling is that this was actually for something else. I think that this was actually used for sewing implements.
That's exactly what I thought, because my grandmother gave me her sewing machine.
So then we look at it and we try to figure what era was it made. The turnings are all very, very uniform. So this was something that was made by a machine lathe, but machine lathes come about as early as the 1850s and 60s. And I think this piece isn't too much later than that. It is likely to date to probably 1870, 1880. Thimble would have gone in the top, and then you would have had your little needles and things down in this bottom case. I know what the item is worth as an object, but this is obviously more interesting because it's connected to family, and literally pieces of family are with it, which is just so cool. So for just an object, if I saw this in a store, I would expect it to be priced at $75 or so.
It's not going anywhere, but back in my time.
Exactly, because, you know, sentimental value is a real value.
I figured it out that it had to be needles because I know they were very precious.
They were very precious, and if you dropped one, it wasn't like the store was 3 blocks down the street. It might be you have to take a train ride to another city to replace them, so people held on to their stuff.
Well, the great grandmother that passed it on down, they lived in the PD Valley of South Carolina with a lot of the Scots who came over.
Yes.
And I think it was the 1820s, 30s. And I think it was just after the War of 1812, and there were still some blockade problems.
That's fascinating, and you're right. There were still blockade problems. Absolutely. Yeah, people don't realize that that continued all the way up until the Civil War, actually. So much of this is thrifted, which is really fun because they can show a whole lot of things. And I think this sign says it the best. So let's think about this while we look at this collection of items, because we have minstrel songs, and you've got blackface and caricature, and then you have two lovely black women who look like normal black people. It's such a strange thing, the combination of Jim Crow inspired caricature, and yet there were also things made for black people that did not caricature them at the time. So Black Americana is very interesting to see the misrepresentation as opposed to the reality of the time. Look at the cover there. We kept our retarded child at home. This is during the time when they're trying to figure out what is the thing to do for children who are not the same ability as others. Do you put them in school together, or do you keep them away from everyone? Well, our attitudes have changed a lot, and this is one thing that's very interesting and poignant to me about old stuff, is that you can see the way things change over time. Oh, there we go. Hee-haw. It's back. So yes, you have ageism, you have racism, you have sexism, and we're still dealing with some isms. The furniture is appropriate for a house of this time. This is an English pub table with the oak from about 1920. This is a very pretty 1920s console set. And I like the green lucite candles. We know those are worth something nowadays from the 60s. And hello there, everybody. This quilt is neat. This is a WPA quilt, 1935. Mrs. Annie Owen was responsible for the WPA sewing room in Quincy. Quincy is the county seat. It's about 10 miles from here. It has 7,000 people today. It was the big city back in this area in the time. And they were telling a very funny story about how the Quincy Ladies Societies would come and get the quote-unquote poor farm girls from this area and teach them about big city stuff that was happening in Quincy. It's really neat because they've got the names of the various people who sewed these together. This china cabinet has a lot of things of the era that we would expect for a house. Service plates, a lot of this is 1920s and 30s. This is a Cambridge pattern, the rose point that you see there. This is 1930s elegant glass. This is if you had a little bit of money, and this family did. So in the 1930s, they would have been able to afford these better goods. And the silk rug is a really pretty one. This is from China. This is from about, again, 1920s or 30s. The Chinese rugs of that period typically were silk, typically had an open field in the center without a lot of design, and the design tended to be near the edges because, of course, you're putting your furniture over the central part of the design. So they stopped emphasizing that part because it's covered up. This was a modern style in the 1930s and very likable now, I think, with the birds on the branch. I don't see these carpets very often. I had an estate sale in Maryland where there were several, and they sold very well, and I really haven't run into many since. The Roseville silhouette is a very pretty piece. And yes, these are uranium green and wood glow, especially this cute little dresser box with 3 birds. Now this stick frame, Adirondack style frame, is something we associate with the 1890s or around 1900. Fans from funeral homes. This one has Martin Luther King on it. This one has Christ. And this one has a chapel in the hills. They would make all sorts of different ones of these and give them out as advertising, sometimes at drugstores to use if there's a parade coming by, but oftentimes funeral homes because you needed a fan, especially here in the South. This is a neat pattern for this old oil lamp. It's got this sort of a turkey foot on the bottom. And then this piece appears to actually be hand-blown glass, which is a little earlier. So this is probably 1880s or 90s. This room has a really handsome piano forte. This is how grand pianos looked. They were rectangular, almost like a spinet piano, but a pianoforte was similar to a grand piano in terms of its sound. This one was made in New York in the 1830s. They're very handsome, and they can be worth thousands and thousands of dollars depending on who the maker is. This one appears to be Culver Randall out of New York.
Remarkably, I found the great-great-great-grandson of the man who made this.
Really?
Who still lives in Orange County, New York, at the mill where this was made.
How cool.
Known to exist.
Wow.
And we have it in Greensboro, Florida.
That is fantastic. Well, exactly. And that's what's so great about places like this is, you know, here's something that's extremely rare, museum quality. It's in a museum. It should be. That's just wonderful. I love that story. And how neat that it was donated and came from the local area. Right. So this is a really early piece from this area when there were very few settlers, when it was just made part of the United States. And it was part of William Monroe's plantation in Gadsden County, Florida.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help. And we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.